Now, as I previously mentioned, naturally Paladins want to take fire, lightning, and physical based damage, and that will be either spells or attacks, but let's quickly dive into two stats that synergize and sets Paladins apart from the rest. We have Attunement and Healing Effectiveness. So if, for example, my heal does 100 health restored, and I get 100% increased healing effectiveness, it says here that healing effectiveness will increase the amount healed by your healing skills. So 100% healing effectiveness, now my heal will now restore 200 health. However, Paladins have many skills that turn your healing effectiveness into damage. So if, for instance, we look at Judgment as a skill, Judgment is a melee skill that leaves consecrated ground. Allies on consecrated ground are healed for 50 health per second. Enemies on consecrated ground take fire damage that scales with spell damage. Consecrated ground gains 1 spell damage per 5 healing effectiveness. So Judgment itself is a two-part attack. You have a melee attack. That melee attack will trigger consecrated ground. On consecrated ground, you get increased spell damage per 5 healing effectiveness. So this means if I have 100 healing effectiveness, I will get 20 spell damage for my consecrated ground. On top of that, with the consecrated ground, it deals fire damage over time. So specifically to scale consecrated ground, I would want to take fire damage over time, and I would want to gain spell damage or healing effectiveness, which will in part increase my spell damage. If I hold Alt, this also tells me that the melee attack applies to the attack at 350% effectiveness. Now this is a melee skill. This means that for the melee part of this particular skill, I would want to get melee damage. So if, for instance, I get melee flat damage, it will apply at 3.5 times the amount. Added spell damage for consecrated ground applies at 225 effectiveness per second. It also says that the melee attack's damage does not scale with the spell damage, and consecrated ground's damage does not scale the melee damage. So this particular skill, if I want to focus on one or the other, I would need to make sure that I understand how the scaling tags work. It specifically states, if I want to increase the damage of consecrated ground, this is purely spell-based, and the Judgment melee attack is purely melee-based. So let's look at one particular item. So I have in my hands here the Hand of Judgment. Now, Hand of Judgment is a unique. I've actually turned it into a legendary and spec'd tier 7 attunement on it, which is absolutely insane. But let's look at this particular unique. So this gives us 3 melee damage per attunement for Judgment while unarmed. This means if I don't have a sword and I just have a shield, this will give us 3 melee damage per attunement. It also gives us 2% increased area per attunement for Judgment while unarmed, minus 12 Judgment mana cost while unarmed. Again, unarmed meaning I don't have a weapon, but shield is okay. Plus 9 attunement. Now this can actually give us up to 16, so I load a little bit roll on this. We have 42% increased cooldown reduction for Judgment and 12% fire penetration. So if I want to focus a build on Hand of Judgment, specifically I would want to look at the melee damage of Judgment, and by that it means getting as much attunement as possible to increase the flat melee damage for Judgment. So on my character sheet I have 91 attunement. This means that the melee attack for Judgment will be 3 times 91. So 273 flat damage for attunement. And of course the added flat damage applies to the attack at 350% effectiveness. So this means that my flat damage will now be 3.5 times more damage. Now you can also see underneath the scaling tags, it says strength scaling. Strength scaling applies at 4% per point. This means each point of strength gives us 104 increased damage. Now, nowhere on this particular skill does it say where strength will apply. So this means that strength will actually apply to the melee portion of this particular skill to contribute the melee damage. The strength will not contribute to the spell, and it won't contribute to healing effectiveness or any consecrated ground in terms of its damage. This means that if I wanted to go for a Hand of Judgment based build, I want to get attunement on every single piece of gear to increase my melee damage, It also means that I want to apply attunement on other portions of my gear to get melee damage. So for instance, on my relic here, I have +3 to judgment to increase the amount of points I can give to judgment. I want to get attunement on my armor pieces and attunement wherever I can. So eventually, if you stack up enough attunement, your judgment will deal a lot of damage in one punch. So attunement will increase our healing effectiveness. Let's look at healing effectiveness as a skill as well. So a different skill we have is Javelin. Now in the base healing tags for Javelin, it says it's physical, throwing, strength, and dexterity. If we progress up the skill tree, you can see now Javelin has a skill node called Holy Trail. If you hold Alt, this tells you how Holy Trail will scale. And Holy Trail is a lightning, fire, spell, and damage over time skill. It also says that added spell damage applies at 250 effectiveness per second. The Holy Trail will heal you and your allies and last for 6 seconds, but Javelin has a cooldown. The amount of health gained is increased by healing effectiveness. So when you throw your Javelin, this will leave a Holy Trail behind. Now you can see here, this particular node also makes Holy Trail gain additional spell damage based on your increased healing effectiveness. And you'll see that this will be a trend. You get increased damage based on your healing effectiveness. So on my character, I have 700 or almost 700 increased healing effectiveness. This will contribute to my spell damage in some way for a different skill. So for the case of Judgment, Path of Judgment, this will give me 1 spell damage per 5% increased healing effectiveness. My Javelin is dealing damage based on its Holy Trail, not from the Javelin itself. If I then want to tailor a build around Holy Javelin, I'll be looking at all the skill nodes that increase my spell damage and my fire and lightning damage. We have fire and lightning damage here, fire and lightning damage here. These are the 2 important skill nodes that you'll be going for if you want to increase your damage. We also want to look at healing effectiveness. Healing effectiveness will give us spell damage. So we want to get healing effectiveness here, healing effectiveness here, healing effectiveness here, healing effectiveness here. There's a lot of healing effectiveness in the Paladin skill tree. Now, looking at high corruption building based builds for Paladin, we have a very important interaction between healing hands and this particular experimental affix. So this affix is current percent of health lost. Instead, you gain the missing health as ward per second. So you can see my health is starting to go down, but I'm gaining a ward instead. So this is the way Paladins have been able to stack tons of ward for insane survivability. Because of this, ward-based Paladin builds currently focused on casting healing hands on yourself as fast as you possibly can. And currently, the main scaling on healing hands is by increasing your healing effectiveness, which you can find in your skills, your passives, gear and idols, and skill tree. So for instance, healing hands has this particular node, Divine Barrier. This will convert your healing hands to ward based on your attunement. If you have high attunement, this will give you some amount of ward. Now, it's also, you have healing effectiveness here, you have healing effectiveness here, and you have nodes that turn your healing hands into a spell. With this node, this will give you spell damage, which scales off of fire damage. You can see now healing hands has the fire skill tag, as well as healing hands giving additional spell damage based on your healing effectiveness, then turning your spell damage into a melee skill. This will turn it into melee damage. Now, when you cast a melee skill, this will trigger your healing hands, and this will give you a chance to give healing hands cast on yourself. So when you do a melee attack, healing hands will deal the damage, plus give you healing hands automatically cast. So here I have Rive. Rive is a combination of 3 melee attacks. I've actually procced it so that it only gives me 2 attacks, but essentially when I do healing hands, it casts. When I do Rive, it will cast healing hands on myself. and that will give me ward. Now if I attack, this gives me a lot of ward. If I attack even quicker, this is giving me like 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 ward. So this is the melee based version of Healing Hands. You can see I can attack with Rive. Rive is a very fast attacking skill. This will give me Healing Hands. Healing Hands will proc tons of ward, give me insane survivability. And of course the way I've done this is by getting attack speed on every single piece of gear that I can get. So here I've got increased melee attack speed, increased melee attack speed on my implicit. We've also got Healing Hands, points to Healing Hands to increase my healing effectiveness, increased healing effective of my shield, attunement. I've got increased fire damage because Healing Hands is a fire skill. We've got increase of healing effectiveness on my amulet, increased healing effectiveness because of my judgment and attunement on my relic. We have increased attunement on here. This gives us healing effectiveness. So a lot of different options to give us healing effectiveness. It means that when we attack, we trigger Healing Hands every time. This will turn into ward, and this will make us very tanky. We've also spec'd it so that Healing Hands actually becomes our main source of damage. This is because our Healing Hands scales off of attunement and healing effectiveness based on our skill node here, which turns Healing Hands healing effectiveness into spell damage. That spell damage is converted into melee damage, and that melee damage will proc each time a melee hit happens. So notice that we do have Healing Hands on our skill bar. The only reason why I've got it on my skill bar is so I can cast Healing Hands on myself, just in case I have no enemies to hit. Because if I attack, you can see that it doesn't actually proc Healing Hands, so this makes us not tanky outside of battle. If I instead manually cast it, you can see my health starts going up very quickly. So the manual cast is there just outside of battle. If I'm not attacking anything, then at least I can still survive to get to attacking something. And so this makes Healing Hands a support skill, but also in our case a main damage skill. And this also turns Healing Hands with this melee build into a sort of form of like pseudo life leech, because as I attack, I'm gaining a lot of tankiness and survivability. I don't need to necessarily build life leech into my build because I've got Healing Hands to do it for me. Now turning Healing Hands into a melee attack skill is one thing. We can also turn it into a spell. If we don't spec into Healing Hands this way to get my healing effectiveness and turn it into a melee damage, we can ignore all of these points here and just instead focus more towards this one. So Healing Hands per smite cast. So I've got a build where every time I do smite, it will proc Healing Hands. This means that when I do smite, it will cast Healing Hands as well. Now, smite is a fire-based skill, it's a spell, and it scales off of attunement. So all of those factors are really useful because, again, I have Healing Hands doing fire damage, it's spell damage, and it's attunement. Attunement gives us healing effectiveness, and so when a smite is cast, it will cast Healing Hands. That makes this node very effective. The other alternative is to focus on this instead, Divine Bolts. Divine Bolts, if I press Alt, it tells us Divine Bolt is a bolt that fires towards an enemy. It's a fire, spell, and attunement based skill. And you can see that damage is applied at 100% healing effectiveness. This means that naturally, if I spec into Healing Bolts, when I heal, it will cast Divine Bolts. You can see as I'm attacking, it procs Divine Bolts and fires towards the enemy. Now, this Divine Bolts node also scales with this one. Divine Bolts, whenever I have a melee attack, it has a 20% chance to cast Divine Bolts. As I keep attacking, it will proc more Divine Bolts, but there's a reduced chance to do it on melee hit. And then we've got ones where it heals them based on the fire damage it will do. Now, if I was to not do a melee based build, because currently this is a melee based build which will cast Divine Bolts, if instead we were to just focus on this one, we would want Healing Hands to just be a spell cast. If we make it a spell cast, we're not doing a melee hit, so we don't need to take these points. We can just make Healing Hands cast on ourselves. When we cast Healing Hands on ourselves, this will fire Divine Bolts at enemies. We would also want it so that this one reduces our cast speed, so we would not take this one. Although it gives us increased damage for Healing Hands, if we want to focus our damage, we can instead have Divine Bolts be the vehicle of our damage, and instead use Healing Hands to just cast Divine Bolts as quickly as possible. In that instance, we would want to get as much cast speed. So here we have, so instead of using my melee attack, I can change my entire build and have Healing Hands cast on myself. This will proc Divine Bolts. Divine Bolts will apply damage with fire, spell, and attunement damage. Also, on your gear pieces, it's important that you focus on your defenses. Paladins tend to do one thing very well, which is gain health, armor, and block chance. So first thing is to cap out your resistances. Resistances are these. You can see my resistances aren't fully capped, but I am getting fairly close to capping them. On your gear, you want health, you want armor, and then generally Paladins like to put on a shield. Now, one reason why Paladins like to put on a shield is because their passive skill trees, their passive tree has a lot of block chance on it. You can see I get 1 block chance here, I can get 1 block chance in Forge Guard, and 1 block chance in the Sentinel Mastery. So with those points, I have 7% increased block chance. This on top of my shield from my implicit. Here you can see I've got 16% block chance, plus the Golden Aegis itself gives us extra block chance. This gives us naturally 75% block chance. Now this is actually quite low. I have a different shield which gives us 8% block chance. That 8% block chance will take us to around 83%. And then if you have, for example, Sigils of Hope, Sigils of Hope has a block chance node. If you were to spec into shield-based Paladin builds, so for example Shield Bash here, you can see Shield Bash has fire damage and physical damage. These are something that Paladins want. If we were to focus on a Shield Bash skill, you can see that Shield Bash gives you block chance as well. So block is something that Paladins do quite well on your gear. So block chance using a shield is very good. Also, if you're using a shield, I have already stated that this tree, Heaven Fire, gives us extra spell damage with a shield, and Sanctuary Guardian gives you spell damage with a shield plus extra armor as well. So using a shield on a Paladin is quite good. This means that if you're using a shield, you're naturally going to be using a one-handed weapon like a sword, axe, wand, scepter, whatever it is. If you're using one of those options as well, in the passive Sentinel tree, you have options for increased attack speed and cast speed if you're using a sword or axe, and increased damage if you're using a scepter or mace. So these are points that you want to look at when you're gearing your Paladin. Boots, you should always get move speed. Although you can get move speed on implicits of other sources, Boots is the main affix where you get your move speed, and so you want to get move speed on your boots. And of course, you want to get class-specific attributes on your relic and helmet and chest if you can get those. So here I've got, for example, on my relic, we've got increased points to Judgment or increased points to Healing Hand if you're going for either one of those builds. Alright, that's been my guide of Paladin. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you've got ideas on different types of Paladin builds that you've been running, and your thoughts on the video, whether you liked it, whether you didn't like it, what I can improve on for next time. Any feedback is welcome. And as always, have an awesome day. Bye for now.